video will walk you through how to administer the PlantLog software. If you just signed up for a trial, you will automatically be the first administrator for that account. Or you might have been granted admin privileges by an existing PlantLog account there at your facility. So the first thing you want to do is access the account by entering in your unique site address into the address bar of any standard desktop browser. This will take you to the sign-in screen for this account, and then we'll go ahead and just sign in with your username or your email address and your password. Now that we're signed in, we can access the main features from the top navigation bar. However, this video will focus on the administration pages accessible from this menu in the upper right corner. So let's get started with the Logs workflow page. The Logs workflow page is where you will define the various assets in your facility that you want to have tracked with the PlantLog software. These are tracked using the Logs feature. So each asset will be assigned a log and most typically a barcode tag as well. And this barcode will be placed on the asset so that it can be scanned using the mobile app. So in the Logs workflow page is where you will not only define these logs or assets, but you will also define the activities that get performed on those assets. For example, a daily inspection or round, as well as a monthly or quarterly PM. And then finally, you will define the items or the tasks or individual readings that will get performed during those activities that were defined. All of this will get done here in the Logs workflow page. So let's get started by creating our first log. We'll do this on the left-hand side in the layout panel. And notice we have a plus button right up here for add. We'll click add. And then the only option we have at this point is to add a group. And the reason for that is because all logs or assets need to be placed in a group. So we first need to add a group. And groups are a way to lay out your facility either by geographical locations or perhaps by functional equipment types. So let's go ahead and add a group, and let's call this group chillers. So this is where we'll be tracking our chiller equipment. Also, notice in these dialogues, these labels here on the left-hand side. This will be group name, subgroup of, and so on. Just as a quick tip, you can always hover your mouse over these labels and get a quick explanation of what is expected for these inputs or dialogues. And you'll see this throughout the PlantLog application. Okay, this is going to be a top-level group. You can actually have subgroups to further organize your facility, but this is going to be a top-level group. So we're going to select none as a subgroup for this group. Finally, we have force barcode, which is always defaulted to enabled. And what this means is that every log or asset we add to this group must be scanned with a barcode scanner using the mobile app in order for an operator to input data on it. The reason for this is that you can get real verification that the operators are physically in front of those assets when they're inputting data. If we were to disable this, then operators would simply be able to tap on the asset name in the mobile app and input data no matter where they are in the facility. And then finally, we have this details box down here. Now I'll just hover over that, and here's the help text. Details is something you're going to see throughout the layout or the logs workflow section. And any object that you add, you have the option to input additional details. And this details can be read on the mobile device by operators. You can basically give them some extra information about this or instructions and so on. Given that we're adding a group called chillers, the details here would refer to the chillers group itself. So you might describe where the chiller room is located in the facility or something to that nature. But we're going to skip that for now, and let's just go ahead and hit add. So now that we created our first group, we can go ahead and create a log. If we come back to the plus button, you'll see we now have more options, and we'll click add log. So under the log, we're going to create our first asset that we'll be tracking with PlantLog, and we'll call this chiller number 1. We can then input a barcode tag. This will be the numeric digits that are printed on the actual barcode tag, and that tag will then get placed somewhere on chiller number 1 for identification. We then want to say where this log is placed within a group. We only have one group right now for chillers, and of course that's where we're going to put it. So we're going to assign this log to the chillers group. And then once again is this details text box. So any additional information that you want to convey to the end users can be entered here in details. So given that we're talking about chiller number 1 now, in this section here we could put some additional information such as the manufacturer to list who makes this chiller. We could put in the serial number of this chiller. We can put in support phone numbers. If you have outside vendors that take care of this equipment, you could put that in here. So any additional information can be entered here, and remember, it always pertains to the object that we're creating. In this case, we're creating a log for chiller number 1. And then finally, we have a checkbox down here that says set inactive. Now, we're creating a brand new asset here, so we're not going to set it to inactive, and we'll cover that a bit later in this video. So now let's just click add to add this log. So now that we've created our first log for chiller number 1, the next step is to create at least one activity for this log or this asset. So we'll highlight the log, we'll then come back to the plus button, and we'll say add activity. And an activity are the periodical events that take place on the various assets within the facility. A common use for PlantLog is to perform daily rounds on the various assets. So let's call this activity daily round. We then want to select the group that this activity pertains to, and then finally the log that this activity is assigned to, chiller number 1. Now, obviously by the name daily round, it implies that it needs to be done every day. So for these type of events or activities, it's a good idea to apply a schedule. So a schedule allows you to dictate when a particular activity needs to be performed on that asset. And the software will remind end users when that time has come so they do not skip these inspections or maintenance activities. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to click apply to apply a schedule. We're then going to set the intervals for this schedule. So given it's a daily round, we're going to say every 1, and then over here on the interval we'll select days. Notice that we have hours, days, weeks, months, and years. So you could schedule much longer running tasks such as quarterly or annual PMs as well. But in this case, we're going to say every 1 day. We then have these two options on how this schedule is going to be calculated. The first option says from last record date. And what that means is that whenever this activity for daily round is performed on chiller 1, it will be due exactly 1 day from that particular time. So if you were doing something that's on a 1-week schedule and you selected that, and this was the last time it was performed was say on a Thursday, then it'll be due exactly 1 week from that Thursday or the following Thursday. The second option is from specific date. So if we select that, we could then choose a specific date, a point in time that will be the next recurrence period for this activity. It's not very useful for a once-a-day activity because every single day it will be due, but just imagine if it was a weekly activity. You could, for example, select a Monday to be the next due date, and the schedule will always be due 1 week from this particular date. So you're essentially saying I want it to be done every Monday of the week. So you would do that. But in this case, let's just go with the rolling schedule and select from last date. And then finally, once again, we have the details box, so you can add in some extra information to the operators, maybe how to perform this particular activity, They might need some safety equipment and so on. So you can add that here in the details section. And then to finish adding this activity, we will simply hit the add button. And you will notice now that we have this sheet of paper under the chiller number 1, which is a activity. And you will also notice it has a yellow bell on top of it. And that's simply indicating to you as an administrator that you have assigned a schedule to this particular activity. Schedules are not mandatory. You do not have to set them. It's just a way for us humans to remember when things are actually due. Okay, we're now ready to start adding items to this log. And items are managed over here on the right-hand side. Items represent the individual readings or tasks that an operator needs to perform when they are in front of this asset and choose a particular activity. In this case, they'll be choosing daily round. So we want to first add the items that need to be done during their daily round. So let's go back and select the log itself, because we're going to be adding the items to the log itself first. This will enable this section over here, the items panel, and once again we have the add button over here. So if we click on this, we have two types of items that we can add, a selection item or a numeric item. So real briefly, a selection item is used when you want to get a response from the end user or the operator that involves some kind of choice that you're giving them. So for example, you might want to ask, what is the power status of this chiller? And the answers or the choices you want to give them will be on or off. That'll be a selection item because they'll be choosing whether the chiller is on or off currently. A numeric item is when you want to track some kind of numerical value, such as a voltage level or a temperature reading or something to that nature. That's when you will use a numeric reading. So all items fall under one of these two categories. So let's create a selection item. The first thing we need to do is input the name of the item. And this is basically the reading that you want the operator to take, or maybe the task that you want them to perform. Let's just call this power status. So we're asking them, what is the status of this chiller? Is it on or off? The next section here says selection set. And this box shows all the selection sets that have been configured in your database as of right now. And a selection set is simply a list of choices grouped together that you will present to an operator when you create a selection item. These are completely customizable, which I'm going to show you in a moment. But this is the list of the selection sets that are in the database as of right now. And it turns out that we have one that's kind of suitable for the power status, and that is this one right here that says on and off. So the operator will have to choose one of these two selections when he inputs the value of the power status for the chiller. So let's just choose this one. The next option here is force note, or as you can see, force note on exception. Now, if you went through the overview and concept video, you'll know that exceptions in PlantLog are regarded as any data that is collected on the assets or anywhere else in the software that is designated as either abnormal or critical in nature. And all exceptions always appear in red in the software. And as you can see, we have a couple exceptions right up here. The name fail in this selection set that says pass and fail is designated as an exception. So it is considered something that is abnormal or critical. So selecting this option down here, force note on exception, will require an operator to input a note if in fact they were to choose a value for this particular item that is designated as an exception. So that is a way. Otherwise, notes are actually optional, and operators do not have to input a note if they don't want to. But in this particular situation, you can dictate that, yes, they do have to put in a note, and they can use that note to explain what corrective actions they've taken to remedy this situation, or things of that nature. So this is another option here. You're basically wanting the operator to put in that note if the value is bad. But in this case, we're going to turn it off because the options we're giving them at this point is just on and off for this particular item. The next section down here is activities. So remember, these items, that you're performing on these assets, they can actually belong to one or several activities. We only have one activity right now, which is the daily round. So we're going to come all here and select the daily round activity. And so what we're saying here is that we want the power status item to be recorded during the daily round. When someone chooses the daily round activity, they will have to input the value for this power status reading. If we had other activities listed for this chiller, for example, a quarterly PM or a monthly PM, we may or may not want to have them record this particular value. So we would only check off the activities that we want the value recorded for. And then once again, you'll see the details box down here. And this time it pertains to the power status. So if you wanted to provide some additional information to the operator about how to record the power status or other noteworthy things, you can enter it here. You're just providing some additional instructions. So let's hit OK to add this selection item. Okay, we just created our first item, which is a selection type item, and it's listed as item number 1 right here. So now let's go ahead and create a numeric item. We'll come back up to the plus button and click Add Numeric Item. Once again, we're going to put in a name for the item. So this is the reading or task that you want done. Let's just call this evap pressure. So they're going to record the evap pressure. The next selection here is called unit. And so given that this is a numeric item, we want to know exactly what this numeric value represents. We want to be as specific as possible. So if we choose this list here, we can see a list of units that we can assign to this numeric item. Given that we're asking for a pressure here, we have one for PSI, so we'll select that. Now, just as a brief note, this is the list of the units that are already set up in the database, and you can customize them as well, which I'll show in a moment. So if you do not see a unit here that you want, you can go ahead and add it yourself. But let's just choose PSI in this case. The next area here is called absolute range, which you can see right here. And absolute range is an optional feature, which is highly recommended to use whenever possible. And to use it, we will click Enforce, and that will set these two text fields to enabled, which are labeled min and max. Now, given that we're recording a numerical value, the absolute range is what is absolutely possible to record for this value under any circumstances, good or bad. So as an example, imagine this pressure reading being read from an analog gauge, kind of like a speedometer, and that gauge starts at 0 and goes all the way up to 100. That would be a good example of an absolute range. So let's input that now. 0 as a minimum and 100 as a maximum. And what we're saying here is that under any circumstances, there's no way an operator can input a value below 0 or above 100, because the gauge for this evap pressure only goes as high and as low as 0 and as high as 100. So what we're doing here is we're telling the software to not allow any values that are outside of this absolute range whatsoever. So, and this is a good thing to do for protecting against human errors, because if an operator's there, he might be distracted. He might intend to put in a value of, say, 80 PSI, and instead he accidentally hits the 0 a second time. And that would mean he would be putting in a value of 800, which would be way off. And enforcing an absolute range will prevent those types of human errors. The next section down here is called optimal range, and this is even more important of a feature. And so let's go off and hit the Enforce button, and we want to use optimal ranges whenever possible. An optimal range is actually what is the range of this reading under normal conditions. So for example, let's say this evap pressure should be between, say, 40 and 80 PSI under normal circumstances. This is what we want to enter as the optimal range. And the optimal range always needs to be an inner range within the absolute range. It always has to fall within these absolute ranges. So what we're doing here is saying that if any value is taken for this evap pressure that is below 40 or above 80, it will be regarded as an exception. And exceptions, as we said, always appear in red, so they are considered abnormal or critical in nature. So this is how we dictate when an exception occurs for a numeric type item, which is through the optimal range. Once again, we have the force note checkbox. So if an operator were to record a value that's outside of optimal range, that will be regarded as an exception, and you can force them to input a note just by checking off this checkbox. So let's just do that in this case. And again, we have to choose which activities this item is being tracked for, and we only have one activity, daily round, so let's just check that off. And finally, again, we have the details, which we can provide additional instructions. For example, if we want to give the operator special instructions on what to do when the reading falls outside of optimal range, we can do that here in the details section. So they can refer to that and take those corrective actions. And then let's go ahead and add this numeric item. So we just added two items to this log named chiller1, and they're both assigned to the daily round activity over here. One is a selection item and one is a numeric item. And continuing to build out your rounds or your PMs or inspections are done in much the same way. You would simply continue going up here and adding the items that you need to have performed during the various activities that you've created. Now, when we made these two items, selections and numerics, I mentioned that they can be customized as well. So in the case of a selection item, you can customize your own list of selection sets, and in the case of numeric items, you would customize your own list of units if the ones in the database are not suiting your needs. So to do that, we come up to the Properties tab up here, and we'll switch over to the Properties tab, and here on the left-hand side are all the selection sets in your database, and on the right-hand side are all the units in the database. If you don't see a selection set that suits your needs, you can create your own over here, and likewise you can create your own list of units. If you see units that you don't need for your purposes, you can also delete them. So let's go ahead and try that out. Let's go ahead and create a new selection set. And when we created that first item called power status, we use the on-off selection set right here. But let's pretend that we need something a little more detailed than that. Let's assume that the power status can also be in an auto mode as well. So we want to add a third option. So let's go create our own unique selection set. We'll click the plus button up here to add selection set. And now we're going to start adding the selections within this set. So we add again, and let's just say on will be our first option. Notice we have this checkbox says is exception. So if we were to designate this choice or selection as an exception, we would check off this checkbox. But on is considered a good thing in this context, so let's leave it off. Let's hit add. Now let's add the new selection called auto. So let's go back and hit auto and add that as a selection. And finally, let's add the off selection. Now let's assume that the chiller, or the power status of this chiller, should never be off. It would be a critical situation if this chiller, the power status, was off. This would be considered not good. So let's go ahead and change this to be an exception. So off is now considered an exception in this particular selection set. So we'll hit add, and now you can see we now have three options instead of two. On and auto, which are normal values, and off, which is considered an exception. Finally, we have this checkbox down here that says allow multiple selections at the same time. And if we check that off, that will mean that the operator can choose more than one option at the same time. So it's more of a multi-select choice. In this particular case, obviously, the power status can only be one of these three, so we're not going to use the multiple choice option here. And now we're going to click add, and now we've added this option here, on, auto, and off. So we can actually go back to that power status item and edit it and change the selection set to use this set instead of the one below it, the simple on and off option. So this is how we customize selection sets. And likewise, if you want to edit the units, if you're creating a numeric item and you do not have a unit here that you need, obviously you come up here, hit the plus button, and add the new unit. Now let's say ppm for parts per million, and hit add. And there you go. You now have a new unit. So let's go back to the general tab. Okay, let's look at these buttons up here in the panel bar. These buttons are always at the top of a panel and let you manipulate the objects within it. So we've been using the plus button pretty extensively, and as you'll know now, it just adds objects into the area that you're focused into. The pencil icon here will edit the selected object. So in this case, we have the chillers group selected. So editing this will allow us to change the name of the group, change its location, and so on. The third button here is the copy button. So let's go ahead down here and select chiller number 1, and then hover over the copy button. And what this allows us to do is to duplicate these objects. So let's just say that you have this chiller all set up the way you like it. You have all your items and all your activities set up properly, but you actually have multiple chillers within your facility. There is no need to go out and create all these items again for your second or third chiller. Instead, you can simply copy the chiller into its own independent copy. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll click copy, and all we need to do is enter a new name. I'll call it chiller number 2, and we add a new barcode, and that's it. That's the only mandatory, but we might want to come in here and change the serial number because this is a different asset, and some other information. And then we just go ahead and click copy. And that has now created an exact duplicate of chiller number 1, but it's a completely independent copy. So if we come now here under chiller number 2, we can see it has a daily round activity as well. And if we select that, we can also see that it has the same 2 items that chiller number 1 has. So this is a quick way to build up your facility without having to re-enter redundant information. The next button we have here is the reorder button, which are these up and down arrows. And what that is used for is to organize your list of logs and activities and even items in the order that operators may encounter them within the facility. So let's just say, for example, that the chiller room is set up in such a way where chiller number 2 is actually the first chiller that will be encountered when the operator enters this room. So let's change the ordering to reflect that. We'll come up here and click the reorder button, and let's move chiller number 2 above chiller number 1. So this is a good idea to reorder your assets in the way that operators will encounter them while they're going out and doing their route. So let's just say reorder, and we can see we've done that here. And in the same concept, we can also reorder these items as well. Maybe you want to have the pressure reading tracked first before the power status, as an example. You can always come over to this area and click on the reorder button. And finally, of course, is the X button, which is to delete whatever is currently selected. And this should be performed with great care, because when you add an assets, for example, chiller number 2, if we were to go ahead and delete this asset, chiller number 2, all of the rounds and records and data that were collected on this particular asset will also be deleted along with this asset. So be very careful when deleting objects here in the administration section. So let's skip ahead now and assume that you've entered all of your assets within the logs workflow. You might end up with something that looks similar to this. So once again, here is the chillers group that we were looking at. This might be a more complete representation of what you're tracking. Here's chiller number 1. These are the activities assigned to it. These are the items that are performed when the operators scan the barcode and choose the activity that they're performing. So this is just an example of what it will look like. These can be reordered to your liking and so on. One more thing I want to point out with this. Let's just assume that one of your assets goes down for maintenance, maybe long-term maintenance for a week or 2. You may not want operators to go out and collect data on that asset for that period of outage. So in those instances, we can select a particular asset, let's just say chiller number 2. We can then edit that asset and come down at the bottom and select the inactive button. If I mentioned this before when we created the first chiller. Setting an asset or a log to inactive, what happens here is you'll see the inactive logo appear on top of that asset. Now what happens here is it basically disappears from the mobile devices and even the desktop web application, and it does not allow operators to input any data on this asset. It's as if it doesn't exist. However, you do not lose any of the historical data or anything of that nature. It's simply removed from operators list, so they're not able to add any additional data. So this is a good thing to do when assets go offline. Also, when you retire assets and you no longer want to use them, You might not want to just delete the entire asset and all its history. You could then instead simply set it to inactive. You also might want to set up a new group called archive or something to that nature and move this asset or log into that archive group so that you have its complete history for long-term storage, but no further data will be collected on it. The journals workflow screen allows you to define the journals you want to have used within your facility and the categories that will get assigned to those journals to better organize the entries made within them. So if you recall, a journal is mostly used for documenting previous events that have taken place within the facility, usually recorded throughout a shift. So a classic use for a journal might be one named shift turnover, where the operators would perhaps at the end of their shift come in and make a few journal entries on what kind of events took place while they were on shift, so that the relieving shift can come on and review those entries and kind of get a feel for what's been going on within the facility. So before we create our first journal, let's first look at journal categories. And to do that, we're going to come under the Properties tab, much like we did in the Logs workflow screen. Under the Properties tab, you'll see the list of default journal categories listed here. And once again, you can create your own list, edit this, add new ones, and so on. Notice, too, that this is very similar to the selection sets in the Logs workflow, where selections can be designated as an exception, which appear in red. Journal categories work in much the same way. You can create a category and then designate it as an exception, if you like. And obviously, exceptions refer to conditions or events that are severe or abnormal in nature. So we have a category here called fire. In case a fire were to take place within the facility, you would categorize it with this, and obviously that's not good, so it's considered an exception. Injury, if an injury were to occur, you could have a category to document that. Security breach, and so on. You can just make your own categories according to your own operational needs. Here is a general one, maintenance, just to document various maintenance events. So let's just take a look at one real quick. Let's say injury, and let's edit this particular category. We're being told that if we were to edit this, that any journal records already using this category will be changed to whatever we rename it to. So just a reminder there. And now we're in the Edit Journal Category dialog. So we give it a name. In this case, it's injury. And down here it says is exception. And in this case, it's checked off. So we're designating the injury category as an exception. Let's cancel out of this. And let's go back to the General tab. So let's go ahead and create a journal now. We'll come over to the Journals panel. We'll click the plus button. And we'll give it a name. And let's just go with that shift turnover journal like we spoke of. So we'll give a name of the journal, and then you'll see a full list of all the categories that were created in the Properties tab. And so now that you're creating this journal, you can now select which categories are applicable to this particular journal that we're creating. So if there's a particular category in here that is not relevant, simply don't select it, and it will not be an option when operators or users go to create an entry for the shift turnover journal. But let's go ahead and check them all off. Let's say they're all applicable for this kind of journal. And now all of these will be a choice that they can select when they create an entry. They will have to pick one of these categories when making an entry. And then finally down below here we have the details box. Much like we had in the Logs workflow page, you can add additional instructions regarding this journal. Maybe you want to give them instructions on what to record, what kind of events to record, or what things not to record, and so on. So there's just auxiliary information you can provide. And we'll go ahead and hit the add button. And now we've just added this journal, and it'll list all the categories that are assigned to this journal. So as another example, you could create other journals for more focused or work type specific needs. So say you have electricians and mechanics on staff, like we spoke about before, you can create an electrician's journal and a mechanics journal. And then you can assign it, those journals, more specific categories that relate to those kind of crafts. So for the electricians, there might be electrical type categories so they can filter out and really focus on the information that they need to communicate with each other without having to review a more generic journal with information that may not be relevant to their work task. The Manage Users screen will let you add, edit, and delete other users that will have access to this account. So as you can see here, this is the one user that we are signed in as, and of course it's an admin user with this checkbox. So let's go ahead and add a new user. We add the plus button. We'll put in a username. Now it's a good idea to use full names here, first and last name. And the reason for this is that if this person were to leave your facility at some point and you were to delete their user account, you would no longer be able to edit their username. So if you were to just put in the name Tom, that could cause confusion for other operators or users that come along with that same first name. So try to use full names here. You want to put in email addresses so that the software can send out notifications of various sorts. Phone number is a good idea. Although it's optional, other users can look up user information such as this so that when they need to contact someone, they can run a report such as the user list, and they can get this kind of contact information for other users. And then finally a password. And at the bottom here, we have a checkbox that says user is admin. And so obviously, if we check this off, this user will be an admin just like we are here. We really only want to set admin users to be the high lead engineers, maybe management or chief engineers. There should be only a limited number of admins in your account. They should be very selective about who is an admin, who is not. Anyone with an admin, of course, has access to this admin menu up here and can manipulate the data just like we were doing here. So let's not make this user an admin and go ahead and hit the add button to create them. So we now have a second user, and as you can see, they're not set up as an admin. One more thing to talk about when it comes to users is deleting users. It's important to remember that when you do delete a user, you are really only inactivating them so that they no longer have access to the PlantLog software, but you are not deleting any of the data that they created while they were an active user. So that's very important to remember. You will still see this user's name, even if you delete them, throughout the software for any of the data, whether they were going out and doing PMs or creating cases or journal entries and so on. All that data will stay intact. Finally, we have the site settings page, and this provides you to change a few overarching behaviors of the software that will affect your entire PlantLog account. So the only two I want to mention here are the top two. This first one here says automatically set item to most recent value, and you can see the description shown here in black. And what that means is that anytime an operator goes to input data on an item within a log, it will automatically default that value to the last value taken. So for example, if the evap pressure for that chiller number 1 that we created earlier was recorded at 75 psi yesterday, then that value will default to 75. And this allows an operator to simply confirm that that value is still at the same pressure reading, or he can make adjustments as needed and then move on. But it does help them speed up data entry when values do not change very often, because the person doesn't have to re-enter that value very often. However, it can promote what we might call pencil whipping, where an operator might be tempted to sort of breeze through the item values because they're being defaulted for him and not actually look at the value more carefully. So depending on your preference, you can set it to yes or no. It defaults to yes. And the next option says only use encrypted barcode tags. And here's that explanation there in black. And this also defaults to yes. And what this means is that if it is defaulted to yes, you can only use the barcode tags provided by PlantLog. You cannot use your own asset tagging system. because the PlantLog barcode tags include encrypted characters to prevent counterfeiting. And this is sort of extra insurance to ensure that the operators are scanning official barcodes placed on the assets rather than, well, it could be just an incorrect barcode that you might have other barcodes on that asset for other reasons. And just for extra verification that they are in fact physically in front of that asset. If, however, you want to use your own barcoding system with PlantLog, you would have to set this setting to no, and that will allow any kind of barcode to be used with the PlantLog system. And it would also still let you use the standard barcodes as well. It just wouldn't make it mandatory. Okay, that's it for this tutorial. Be sure to watch other videos in this series which cover different aspects of the PlantLog software.